In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a quaint fate hides a chilling secret. A weathered birdhouse, perched high in an oak, conceals the dismembered remains of Gideon Vale, a reclusive ornithologist. As whispers of murder ripple through the village, Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, uncovers a web of coded letters, hidden diamonds, and a mysterious stranger lurking in the shadows. A boy's disappearance and a widow's buried secrets deepen the mystery. Could a rare falcon hold the key to a deadly smuggling ring? With every clue, danger closes in, but the final truth lies in a confrontation that will unravel a village's darkest secret, or bury it forever. Chapter 1. The Village, whispering the gentle hum of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the predictability of a well-wound clock. The village stirred with the kind of subdued excitement that only a summer fete could muster. The vicarage garden, a patchwork of neatly trimmed lawns and blooming flower beds, was alive with the chatter of villagers, their voices mingling with the clink of teacups and the laughter of children darting between stalls. The air carried the scent of freshly baked scones, lavender from Mrs. Price's herb garden, and the faint tints of lemonade served in chipped glass jugs. At the heart of this scene sat Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure tucked into a wick chair beneath a sycamore tree, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as her observations. Her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, not the flush on Mrs. Price's cheeks as she fussed over the tambola, nor the way Mr. Cobb, the landlord of the Blue Boar, lingered a touch too long at the cake stall, exchanging hushed words with the baker's wife. Miss Marple's hands moved deftly, the soft wool of her latest project, a pale blue shawl for her niece's newborns, slipping through her fingers. She had chosen this spot deliberately, not for the shade, though it was pleasant, but for its vantage point. From here, she could see the entire garden, the bunting strung between trees, the children playing hoopla, and the vicar, Mr. Clement, attempting to mediate a dispute over a jar of homemade jam. Yet her attention was drawn, as it often was, to the smallest details, the ones others overlooked. Today, it was the old birdhouse, perched high on an oak at the garden's edge, its weathered wood sagging under the weight of time, its paint peeling in curls like the secrets it seemed to hold. It was an odd thing, that birdhouse, too large for sparrows, yet too small for anything grander, and positioned so high that only a determined child or a curious cat might notice it. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had always thought it peculiar, though she couldn't say why. The fete was in its third hour when young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, sidled up to his friend Billy Higgs near the coconut shy. Tommy, a lanky lad of 13 with a mop of unruly hair, was known for his tales, most of which were dismissed as the exaggerations of youth. But today, his voice carried a tremor that caught Miss Marple's ear. She leaned forward slightly. Her knitting paused as Tommy whispered to Billy, his words half lost in the breeze. "Saw something odd in that birdhouse," he said, jerking his thumb toward the oak. "Went to fetch me ball after it got stuck in the branches, and there was something queer up there. Not a bird, neither." Billy, a stocky boy with a skeptical squint, snorted. "You're daft, Tommy. It's just a birdhouse. Probably a dead sparrow or summit." Tommy shook his head, his eyes wide. "Weren't no sparrow. I'm telling ya, it was wrong." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was elsewhere. Boys like Tommy were prone to fancy, yet there was a note in his voice, fear, perhaps, or uncertainty, that suggested he'd seen more than a dead bird. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him. though she told herself it was likely nothing. St. Mary Mead was a place of small dramas, not great mysteries. Still, her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature in its quietest corners, whispered that something was amiss. The afternoon wore on, and the fete reached its peak. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, and the crowd began to thin. Mrs. Price, her apron dusted with flour, bustled over to Miss Marple with a cup of tea and a slice of Victoria sponge. "Jane, you've hardly moved all day," she said, her voice warm but tinged with the strain of her duties. "I do hope you're enjoying yourself." Miss Marple smiled, her face softening into the gentle expression that so often disarmed. Her neighbours, oh, immensely, Margaret. "It's a lovely fete. You've outdone yourself." Mrs. Price beamed, though her eyes darted to the tombola, where a queue was forming. "It's all for the church roof, you know. We're hoping to raise enough this year." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Though I must say, I'm a bit worried about young Tommy Pierce. He was helping with the stalls earlier, but I haven't seen him since lunch. His mother will have my head if he's run off again." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver, but her mind sharpened. "Tommy's a lively boy," she said mildly. "No doubt he's off exploring. Boys do that, don't they?" Mrs. Price nodded, reassured, and hurried back to her duties. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Tommy's absence. She glanced again at the birdhouse, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The oak's branches swayed gently, and for a moment she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, perhaps, or a shadow that didn't belong. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the unease remained, settling in her bones like the damp of an autumn evening. As the fete wound down, the villagers began to drift home, their baskets laden with prizes and their spirits buoyed by the day's small joys. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way toward the vicarage gate, her steps slow but deliberate. She paused by the oak, her eyes tracing the birdhouse's outline. It was too high to see clearly without a ladder, and she had no intention of climbing trees at her age. But she noted its position, half hidden by leaves, accessible only to someone determined or desperate. She thought of Tommy's words again, and a faint frown creased her brow. That evening, as she sat by her cottage fire with a cup of chamomile tea, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the birdhouse. St. Mary Mead was a village of habits, its rhythms as predictable as the church bells on Sunday. Yet every village, she knew, had its undercurrents, jealousies, grudges, secrets tucked away like letters in a locked drawer. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a gardener in Chipping Cleghorn had hidden stolen silver in a hollowed-out tree. The parallel was tenuous, but it nagged at her. She resolved to speak to Tommy in the morning, to hear his story firsthand. Boys, after all, saw things adults missed, their eyes unclouded by the assumptions of age. Sleep came slowly that night, her dreams threaded with images of the birdhouse, its dark entrance gaping like a silent mouth. She woke early, the dawn light filtering through her lace curtains, and dressed with her usual care, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that matched the season's softness. Her cottage, with its rose-covered trellis and neatly swept path, was a haven of order, but her mind was already at the vic. She breakfasted lightly, tea and toast with a thin spread of marmalade set out, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The vicarage was quiet when she arrived. The remnants of the fete cleared away, save for a few forgotten streamers tangled in the grass. The oak stood sentinel at the garden's edge, its birdhouse unchanged, yet somehow more ominous in the morning light. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes scanning the ground below. There, half buried in the dew-damp earth, was a cricket ball, its red leather scuffed. She bent to pick it up, her movements careful, and noted a faint smear of something dark mud, perhaps, or something else. She tucked the ball into her basket, her expression thoughtful. Constable Hurst was already at the vicarage, summoned by Mrs. Price, who stood wringing her hands at the gate. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice tight with worry. "It's Tommy. He didn't come home last night. His mother's beside herself, and we've searched everywhere." The constable, a young man with an earnest face, nodded gravely. "We're checking the village now, ma'am. Thought I'd start here, since he was at the fete." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the birdhouse. "Did Tommy say anything to you yesterday, constable? Anything unusual?" Hurst frowned, scratching his chin. "Not to me, ma'am. But Billy Higgs mentioned Tommy was going on about that birdhouse. Said he saw something odd in it. Probably just a lad's tale." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I wonder if we might take a closer look." Hurst followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "It's a bit high up, ma'am. I'd need a ladder." Mrs. Price, overhearing, offered to fetch one from the vicarage shed, and soon Hurst was climbing the oak, his boots scraping against the bark. Miss Marple stood below, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on the birdhouse. The constable reached it, peered inside, and froze. His face, already pale from the climb, turned ashen. "Good Lord," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Miss Marple, you'd best stay back." But Miss Marple was not one to stay back. "What is it, constable?" she asked, her tone calm but insistent. Hurst hesitated, then descended, his movements unsteady. "There's something in there, ma'am. Not a bird. It's a body, or parts of one." Mrs. Price gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her eyes gleamed. With a quiet intensity, "A body," she repeated, as if testing the word, "in a birdhouse. How extraordinary." Hurst nodded, wiping his brow. "It's impossible, but it's there. Looks like a man's hand, and other bits. Can't see much without talking it down." Miss Marple's mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the morning. A body in a birdhouse was no ordinary crime. It was deliberate, calculated. The work of someone who wanted to hide their deed in plain sight. She thought of Tommy's absence, the smear on the cricket ball, the birdhouse's odd placement. "We must send for the inspector," she said briskly, "and we must find Tommy Pierce. He may know more than he realizes." The village, so peaceful hours before, was soon abuzz with whispers. The fete, a memory of joy, was now overshadowed by horror. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham, his face grim as he examined the birdhouse, now carefully lowered to the ground. The contents were gruesomer, hand, a foot, and other fragments, meticulously dismembered and crammed into the tiny space. The victim was identified as Mr. Gideon Vale, a reclusive ornithologist who had taken up residence in St. Mary Mead only a month prior. His cottage, a mile from the village, was filled with stuffed birds and journals, but no obvious motive for his murder. Miss Marple, standing at a discreet distance, noted the precision of the cuts, the choice of the birdhouse, the absence of blood at the scene. This was no act of passion, she thought. This was a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. As the police cordoned off the area, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her basket heavier with the cricket ball and her thoughts heavier still. She sat by her window, her knitting untouched, and considered the players in this grim drama. Tommy Pierce, missing since the fete, had seen something in the birdhouse, something that might have put him in danger. Gideon Vale, a stranger to the village, had been no ordinary bird watcher. His death suggested secrets worth killing for, and the birdhouse itself, an unlikely hiding place, spoke of a mind both clever and perverse. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she gazed at her garden, where roses nodded in the breeze. She had seen such minds before, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in the smallest gestures, a glance, a whisper, a shadow in a birdhouse. The village clock struck noon, its chimes carrying across the green. Miss Marple rose, her resolve firm. She would speak to Billy Higgs, to Mrs. Price, to anyone who might have seen Vale or Tommy in the days before the fete. She would visit Vale's cottage, examine his belongings, seek the thread that tied this crime together. For now, she knew one thing: the birdhouse was not just a hiding place. It was a message, a challenge, and Miss Jane Marple was never one to ignore a challenge. Chapter 2. A disturbing discovery. The morning sun had barely crested the rooftops of St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple set out. Her steps measured but purposeful, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The village was hushed, its usual rhythm disrupted by the grim discovery at the vicarage garden. The news of Mr. Gideon Vale's remains, stuffed into the old birdhouse like some macabre relic, had spread faster than a summer cold, and already the air was thick with speculation. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle gossip. Her mind, sharp as the knitting needles tucked into her basket, was fixed on the facts, or rather, the lack of them. A body in a birdhouse was not merely shocking. It was deliberate, a puzzle designed to provoke and perplex. And then there was young Tommy Pierce, still missing, his absence a shadow that darkened her thoughts. She arrived at the vicarage to find Constable Hurst pacing beneath the oak tree, his youthful face etched with unease. The birdhouse, now removed from its perch, sat on a tarpaulin, guarded by a nervous young policeman who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Inspector Craddock, summoned from Much Benham, was directing to officers as they combed the garden for clues. Mrs. Price hovered nearby, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes darting between the birdhouse and the small crowd of villagers gathered at the gate. Miss Marple approached quietly, her presence unassuming yet impossible to ignore. "Good morning, Constable," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I trust you've had no further trouble." Hurst turned, his hat slightly askew, and managed a nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. Trouble's the word for it. Never seen anything like this in all my years." He glanced at the birdhouse, his jaw tightening. "The inspector's waiting for the coroner, but it's clear enough what we've got. Poor Mr. Vale chopped up like that and stuffed in there. It's unnatural." Miss Marple's eyes followed his gaze. The birdhouse, a crude wooden box with a slanted roof, was unremarkable save for its grim contents. She noted its size barely large enough for a nesting sparrow, let alone the remains of a man. The precision required to fit such fragments into so small a space suggested not only cruelty but calculation. "Indeed," she murmured, "it's most curious. Have you found anything else? Anything near the tree, perhaps?" Hurst shook his head. "Nothing yet, ma'am. Just that cricket ball you spotted. The inspector's got it now." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The cricket ball, with its faint dark smear, was tucked away in her memory as a piece of the puzzle. She turned to Mrs. Price, who was ringing. her hands with renewed vigor. "Margaret, dear, have you heard anything of Tommy Pierce?" Mrs. Price's eyes welled up. "Not a word, Jane. His mother's frantic. She says he never came home after the fete, and he's not one to wander far. I feel dreadful, thinking he was helping with the stalls, and then—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There, we'll find him. Boys are resilient, you know." But her words, though kind, belied her concern. Tommy's mention of something queer in the birdhouse, overheard at the fete, now carried a weight she couldn't dismiss. Had he seen something or someone that put him in danger? She glanced at the oak, its branches bare of answers, and made a mental note to speak to Billy Higgs again. Boys talk to boys, and Billy might know more than he'd told the constable. Inspector Craddock approached, his face stern but softened by a flicker of respect as he spotted Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I might have known you'd be here. Got a nose for these things, haven't you?" She smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. "I'm merely an old woman with too much time, Inspector. But I couldn't help overhearing about Mr. Vale. Such a dreadful business. Have you learned anything more?" Craddock sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not much, I'm afraid. The coroner's on his way, but it's clear Vale was killed elsewhere. There's no blood here. The cuts are clean, professional almost. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the implications. "And the birdhouse itself. It's an odd choice, don't you think?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Odds, putting it mildly. It's like they wanted it found, but not too soon. That birdhouse hasn't been touched in years, from what the vicar says. Perfect place to hide something if you don't expect anyone to look." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her basket. "Or perhaps," she said softly, "they wanted to send a message." The inspector gave her a sharp look, but before he could respond, a shout came from the garden's edge. One of the officers had found something, a scrap of cloth caught on a bramble near the vicarage wall. Craddock excused himself, and Miss Marple watched as he examined the find, a small piece of grey wool, frayed but distinct. It could belong to anyone, she thought, yet it was another thread in the tapestry of this crime. She made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Price had retreated to make tea, her hands trembling as she set out cups. "Jane, do you think Tommy's involved in this?" Mrs. Price asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple considered her words carefully. "I think Tommy saw something he wasn't meant to," she said. "But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Tell me, Margaret, did you notice Mr. Vale at the fete? He was a quiet man, I understand, but he must have spoken to someone." Mrs. Price frowned, pouring tea with a clatter. "He was there, briefly, kept to himself, mostly near the bookstall. I saw him talking to Mrs. Henshaw, you know, Clara, from Rose Cottage. She's keen on gardening, like he was on birds. I thought it odd, him being so new and her so reserved." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Clara Henshaw was a widow, sharp-tongued and solitary, who tended her roses with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Her cottage, on the village outskirts, was a place of beauty but also isolation. That Vale, a stranger, had sought her out was a detail worth pursuing. "Thank you, Margaret," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "You've been most helpful." She rose, her mind already mapping the path to Rose Cottage. The walk to Clara Henshaw's was pleasant, the lanes lined with hedgerows and the air sweet with honeysuckle. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the scenery. She recalled what little she knew of Gideon Vale, man in his 50s, wiry and bespectacled, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead with a trunk full of books and a passion for birds. His cottage, rented from old Mr. Bantry, was said to be cluttered with taxidermy and journals, a shrine to his ornithological studies. Yet his death suggested something more sinister than a love of feathers. And Tommy Pierce, poor boy, was a loose end that tugged at her heart. Rose Cottage came into view, its garden a riot of colour, the roses climbing the walls like a living tapestry. Clara Henshaw was kneeling by a flower bed, her hands deep in the soil, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Marple," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her gloves. "This is a surprise. To what do I owe the visit?" Her tone was polite but guarded, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands. "I was passing by," Miss Marple said, her voice light, "and couldn't resist admiring your roses. They're quite splendid this year." Clara's face softened, though her eyes remained wary. "Thank you. They take work, but they're worth it." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the garden. "I understand you spoke to Mr. Vale at the fete. He was interested in birds, I believe. Did he ask you about anything in particular?" Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear. "Birds, yes," Clara said quickly. "He wanted to know about the local species. Sparrows, mostly. I told him I'm no expert." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Of course, it's just that, with his unfortunate end, one wonders about his last days." Clara's lips tightened, and she turned back to her roses. "I hardly knew him, Miss Marple. A passing chat, nothing more." The dismissal was clear, but Miss Marple was undeterred. She thanked Clara and left, her mind cataloguing the widow's unease, the freshly turned soil in the flower bed, the way her hands had trembled. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The birdhouse, the body, Tommy's absence, Clara's reticence, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own shape and significance. She thought of a case years ago, when a young woman in St. Mary Mead had hidden stolen letters in a garden shed, believing them safe from prying eyes. The parallel was faint, but it reminded her that secrets were often buried close to home. She resolved to visit Vale's cottage next, to see what his belongings might reveal. For now, she sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the flames, and let her mind wander through the village, seeking the thread that would unravel this disturbing discovery. Chapter 3. The ornithologist's secrets. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Gideon Vale's cottage. Her basket, as always, hung lightly from her arm, concealing the cricket ball from the vicarage garden, its faint dark smear still a quiet question in her mind. The village was subdued, the horror of the Birdhouse discovery settling over it like a fog. Whispers followed Miss Marple as she passed the post office, where Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, was recounting the tale to a cluster of wide-eyed customers. Miss Marple paid them no mind. Her thoughts were fixed on Vale, a man whose life and death seemed to hold more shadows than the oak tree that had cradled his remains. Vale's cottage, a squat stone building on the edge of the village, was leased from Colonel Bantry, whose estate bordered the meadows. It stood alone, its windows curtained, its garden overgrown with nettles and thistles, a stark contrast to Clara Henshaw's meticulous roses. Miss Marple approached the door, where Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was waiting. He had been summoned by Inspector Craddock to assist with the investigation. His medical expertise needed to examine the gruesome fragments found in the birdhouse. His face, usually genial, was drawn, his eyes shadowed with the weight of what he'd seen. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, managing a tired smile. "I shouldn't be surprised to see you here. The inspector said you might turn up." Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes crinkling behind her spectacles. "I'm merely curious, Doctor. A man like Mr. Vale, so new to our village, and now this tragedy. I thought his home might tell us something." Haydock nodded, pushing open the door. "You're not wrong. There's something odd about this place. Come, see for yourself." The cottage was dim, its air thick with the musty scent of old books and preserved feathers. Every surface was cluttered with the trappings of Vale's ornithological passion. Glass cases of stuffed birds, their eyes glinting like beads. Shelves lined with journals, their pages yellowed, and sketches of wings and beaks pinned to the walls like maps of an unknown world. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the order beneath the chaos: a desk neatly arranged, a chair pushed in, a single teacup washed and set to dry. Vale had been a man of precision, she thought, yet his death suggested a disruption of that order. Dr. Haydock led her to the desk, where Inspector Craddock had left a few items for examination. "The police have been through most of it," he said, "but there's a locked drawer here that's got the inspector curious. Thought you might want to look before we force it." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the desk's edge, her eyes fixed on the small brass lock. "A locked drawer is always interesting," she murmured. "People lock away what they don't want seen." Haydock, with a wry smile, produced a paper knife from his pocket. "Shall we?" he asked, and at her nod, he deftly pried the drawer open. Inside was a trove of secrets, a bundle of letters tied with string, a small notebook filled with cryptic symbols, and a photograph of a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a guarded smile. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. She lifted the photograph, studying the woman's features: high cheekbones, dark hair swept into a bun, a hint of defiance in her gaze. "Do we know her?" she asked, her voice soft. Haydock shook his head. "Not yet. The inspector's sending it to the station for identification. But those letters," he gestured to the bundle, his brow furrowing. "They're in some sort of code. Craddock thinks it's gibberish, but I'm not so sure." Miss Marple untied the string and scanned the first letter. The words were a jumble of letters and numbers, arranged in neat rows, as if following a pattern. She recalled a case from her youth, when a vicar's wife had used a similar code to hide her correspondence with a wayward brother. "It's a cipher," she said quietly, "not uncommon for those with something to hide." She set the letters aside, her mind already turning to the notebook. Its pages were filled with more symbols, interspersed with sketches of birds, falcons, hawks, and one that looked suspiciously like a peregrine, rare for these parts. She made a mental note to consult her nephew Raymond's encyclopedia later. Haydock watched her, his curiosity evident. "You think Vale was up to something, don't you?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "I think Mr. Vale was more than an ornithologist, Doctor. His death, the birdhouse, these letters, it's all too deliberate to be mere coincidence." She paused, her eyes drifting to a shelf where a stuffed owl stared down, its glass eyes unblinking. "Did you know him at all?" she asked. Haydock shrugged. "Met him once or twice. Quiet chap, kept to himself. But I heard he was at the Blue Boar a few nights ago, arguing with some fellow. The landlord mentioned it to the inspector. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her basket, seemed to itch for her hands. An argument at the pub was a thread worth pulling. "What sort of fellow?" she asked, her tone casual. Haydock frowned, recalling a stranger from what I heard. Dark coat, kept his hat low. They were talking about birds, or so the barmaid thought. Something about a delivery that didn't go as planned. Miss Marple's mind seized on the word. A delivery in a village like St. Mary Mead could mean anything from milk to mischief. She thought of the coded letters, the peregrine sketch, the photograph. Vale's life, it seemed, was a nest of secrets, and his death had cracked it open. She thanked Haydock and stepped outside. The morning air cooled against her face. The cottage's garden, neglected as it was, held her attention for a moment. A patch of earth near the gate looked freshly disturbed, though no plants grew there. She filed it away, like the cricket ball, as a detail to revisit. As she walked back to the village, her thoughts turned to Clara Henshaw, who had spoken to Vale at the fete. Clara's unease, her trembling hands, suggested she knew more than she'd let on. And Tommy Pierce, still missing, was a worry that gnawed at her. Had he seen the stranger from the pub? Or something in the birdhouse that marked him as a threat? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched as she pored over the morning's findings. The coded letters, the photograph, the argument at the Blue Boar, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own shape and weight. She thought of a long-ago summer, when a smuggler in St. Mary Mead had hidden stolen jewels in a hollowed-out fence post, believing it safe from prying eyes. The parallel was faint, but it stirred her imagination. Vale's ornithology, she suspected, was a cover for something darker, perhaps smuggling, perhaps blackmail. The peregrine sketch hinted at rare birds, valuable in certain circles, but the coded letters suggested something more intricate. She rose, her movements brisk, and reached for her coat. The Blue Boar would be open soon, and the barmaid, Elsie, was a talkative sort. Miss Marple would listen, as she always did, letting the villagers' whispers guide her. For now, she knew one thing. Gideon Vale's secrets were buried deep, but not so deep that a determined old woman couldn't unearth them. Chapter 4. The Pub's Whispers, the Blue Boar. St. Mary Mead's only public house stood at the heart of the village like a weathered sentinel, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of years, and its sign creaking in the late morning breeze. Miss Jane Marple approached its oak door with her usual unhurried grace, her basket tucked under her arm, the faint clink of her knitting needles a quiet counterpoint to the hum of village life. The sun was high now, casting dappled shadows through the elms that lined the high street. But the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over St. Mary Mead since the discovery in the vicarage birdhouse. Gideon Vale's gruesome end was the talk of every hearth and doorstep, and Miss Marple knew that the Blue Boar, with its loose tongues and warm ale, was the place to hear the villagers' pulse. Inside, the pub was a haven of low beams and polished brass, the air thick with the scent of hops and pipe smoke. A few regulars sat at the bar, their voices hushed as they traded theories about Vale's murder. Miss Marple chose a corner table near the window where she could observe without drawing attention. Her lavender, cardigan, and neat hat blended into the woodwork, a deliberate choice that allowed her to fade into the background. She ordered a pot of tea from Elsie, the barmaid, whose rosy cheeks and quick smile belied a knack for overhearing what others missed. Elsie set the teapot down. With a clatter, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said, lingering as she arranged the cup and saucer. Mr. Vale, all cut up like that. Gives me the shivers, it does. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. Dreadful, indeed. Elsie, I understand Mr. Vale was here a few nights ago. Did you see him? Elsie's hands paused on the tray, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping. Oh, he was here, right at that table by the fire. Quiet as a mouse, usually, but that night he was with a man I didn't know. They were talking low, like they didn't want to be heard. Miss Marple poured her tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving Elsie's face. A stranger, you say? That's unusual for St. Mary Mead. Elsie nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. He was a tall sort, dark coat, hat pulled down. I couldn't see his face proper, but he had a sharp way of token. I heard M mention falcon once or twice. Thought it was about birds, seeing as Mr. Vale was so keen on M. But it didn't sound friendly. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her cup. Falcon, she repeated softly. How interesting did they seem? Agitated, Elsie frowned, her brow creasing. Now you mention it. Mr. Vale was fidgety, kept looking at the door. The other man, he was pushing a paper across the table, like he wanted Mr. Vale to sign something. I didn't hear much else. Mr. Cobb called me to the bar then. She glanced at the landlord, who was polishing glasses with a practiced air. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. You've a good memory, Elsie. Most helpful. As Elsie bustled off, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the word falcon. It was no coincidence, she felt, that Vale's notebook had contained a sketch of a peregrine falcon, a bird rare in these parts but prized in certain circles that dealt in more than feathers. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond, who had once mentioned the use of bird names as code in smuggling rings. The stranger, the paper, the argument, it suggested a transaction gone awry, perhaps one tied to the coded letters in Vale's drawer. Her mind flicked to the photograph of the woman with sharp eyes. Could she be the key, or merely another thread in this tangled web? Mr. Cobb, the landlord, approached her table, his broad face creased with a smile that didn't quite reach his. Eyes, Miss Marple, he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. Not often we see you here. Care for a scone with that tea? She declined politely, her gaze steady. Thank you, Mr. Cobb, but I'm quite content. I was just thinking of poor Mr. Vale. Elsie mentioned he was here recently, with a stranger. Did you notice anything? Cobb's smile faltered, and he glanced toward the bar. Well, now, I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but Vale was an odd one, kept to himself, mostly. That night, though he was different, paid for his drinks with a crisp £10 note, which struck me as queer. He wasn't the sort to carry cash like that. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. A £10 note, that is unusual. She filed the detail away, her mind conjuring images of a man living frugally yet handling money that suggested wealth or payment. And the stranger, she prompted. Cobb shrugged, his eyes sliding away. Didn't get a good look. He left quick, after Vale. Didn't even finish his pint. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind buzzing. A crisp note, a hurried exit, a mention. Of falcon, the pieces were small, but they were beginning to form a pattern. She finished her tea and stepped outside, the village air cool against her face. The high street was quiet now, save for a few children playing near the church. Her thoughts turned to Clara Henshaw, whose brief encounter with Vale at the fete seemed more significant in light of the pub's whispers. Clara's trembling hands, her guarded answers, suggested she knew something, perhaps not the whole truth, but enough to make her nervous. And Tommy Pierce, still missing, was a shadow that loomed larger with each passing hour. Had he overheard Vale and the stranger, or seen something at the Birdhouse that marked him as a threat? Miss Marple made her way home, her steps slow but deliberate. At her cottage, she sat by her window, her knitting untouched as she reached for Raymond's old encyclopedia. She flipped to the section on birds, her eyes scanning the entry on peregrine falcons. Their value in falconry, their rarity in England, their use in certain illicit trades, it was all there, a faint echo of the smuggling case she'd recalled earlier. The word falcon in the pub, the sketch in Vale's notebook, the coded letters, they pointed to a scheme that went beyond St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. She thought of the photograph again, the woman's sharp eyes staring back at her. Was she a partner, a victim, or something else entirely? The village clock chimed, its notes carrying across the green. Miss Marple rose, her resolve firm. She would visit Clara Henshaw again, perhaps under the guise of admiring her roses. And she would speak to Billy Higgs, who might know more about Tommy's whereabouts. For now, she knew one thing. The whispers in the Blue Boar were not idle gossip. They were clues, faint but clear, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. Chapter 5. The woman in the photograph. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the hedgerows as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Rose Cottage. Her basket, ever present, swung gently at her side, its contents unremarkable save for the cricket ball, now wrapped in a handkerchief, its dark smear a silent reminder of the vicarage garden. The village was quieter than usual, the shock of Gideon Vale's murder still rippling through its lanes, like a stone dropped in a pond. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were fixed on the photograph found in Vale's desks, the woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, whose guarded smile hinted at secrets as deep as those buried in the Birdhouse. Clara Henshaw, the widow of Rose Cottage, had admitted to a fleeting conversation with Vale at the fete, but her trembling hands and evasive answers suggested more. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the veneer of village life, intended to find out what Rose Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its stone walls half hidden by climbing roses, their petals a vivid scarlet against the weathered grey. The garden was a marvel, each bed meticulously tended, the soil dark and rich, as if Clara poured her solitude into the earth. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the scene. A spade leaned against the wall, its blade caked with fresh dirt, and a small patch near the rose bushes looked recently disturbed. The earth turned in a way that spoke of purpose rather than planting. She filed the observation away, her mind sharp as the thorns that guarded Clara's domain. Clara was in the garden, kneeling by a bed of marigolds, her wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across her face. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, rising and brushing soil from her gloves, "twice in as many days. My roses must be more famous than I thought." Her tone was light, but her eyes were guarded, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw. "Oh, they are splendid," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm and disarming. "I couldn't resist another look. And, of course, I wanted to see how you're faring with all this dreadful business about Mr. Vale." Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of unease. "It's terrible," Clara said, her voice low. "I barely knew him, as I told you. Just a chat about birds at the fete." I can't imagine why anyone would do such a thing. She turned back to her marigolds, her movements brisk. As if to dismiss the topic, Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes soft but piercing. Of course, she said, though I understand Mr. Vale was quite particular about his birds. Did he mention anything specific? A rare species, perhaps? Clara's fingers paused in the soil, and Miss Marple caught the faintest tremble. Sparrows, I think, Clara said quickly. Nothing special. I told him I'm no expert on birds. She stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and gestured toward the cottage. Would you like some tea? It's getting warm out here. Miss Marple accepted, her smile serene, and followed Clara inside. The cottage was tidy, its walls adorned with watercolors of flowers, a stark contrast to Vale's cluttered shrine. To ornithology, as Clara busied herself with the kettle, Miss Marple's gaze wandered, settling on a small framed photograph on the mantel of younger Clara, standing beside a man with a roguish smile, his arm around her. The resemblance to the photograph in Vale's drawer was striking, though the man was not present in the latter. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. Such a charming home, she said, settling into a chair. That photograph, is it a relative? Clara glanced at the mantel, her expression tightening. My late fiancé, she said shortly. He passed years ago. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. I'm so sorry. It must be difficult, even now. Clara poured the tea, her hands steady but her eyes distant. It was a long time ago, she said. I've learned to live with it. The conversation turned to village matters, the fete, the church roof, the weather, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Clara's fiancé, she recalled, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. A story whispered in St. Mary Mead years before. Some said he'd run off, others that he'd met a darker fate. The photograph in Vale's drawer suggested a connection, though its nature was unclear. Had Vale known Clara's fiancé, or had he stumbled upon something tied to her past? As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation back to Vale. It's curious, isn't it, she said, her tone musing, how Mr. Vale came to St. Mary Mead so suddenly. A man so devoted to birds, yet he chose our quiet village. I wonder if he was looking for something or someone. Clara's cup clinked against its saucer, and for a moment her eyes met Miss Marple's, sharp and searching. I wouldn't know, she said, her voice clipped. Like I said, we barely spoke. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. Of course. I'm just an old woman, letting my thoughts wander. She rose, thanking Clara for the tea, and stepped back into the garden. As she passed the disturbed patch of earth, she paused, her gaze lingering. You've been busy with your planting, she said lightly. That patch looks freshly turned. Clara followed her gaze, her face pulling slightly. Just weeding, she said. The roses need constant care. Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched as she turned the morning's findings over in her mind. Clara's unease, the photograph, the disturbed soil, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own weight, she thought. Of a case from her youth, when a widow in Chipping Cleghorn had buried stolen silver in her garden, believing it safe from prying eyes. The parallel was faint, but it stirred her imagination. Clara's fiancé, the stranger at the Blue Boar. The word falcon, they were threads in a tapestry, and Vale's death was the knot that bound them. She reached for her nephew Raymond's encyclopedia, flipping to the section on falcons. The peregrine, she read, was not only rare but valuable, its feathers and even its eggs prized in certain circles. Could Vale's ornithology have been a cover for something more illicit? And Clara, with her guarded eyes and trembling hands, was she a victim, a conspirator, or something else entirely? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tommy Pierce, still missing, his absence a shadow that grew darker with each passing hour. Had he seen something in the birdhouse, or someone that put him in danger? The village clock chimed, its notes soft in the evening air. Miss Marple rose, her resolve firm. She would speak to Inspector Craddock to see if the photograph had been identified, and she would keep an eye on Clara's garden, where secrets, like roses, might be buried just beneath the surface. For now, she knew one thing: the woman in the photograph was no mere memory. She was a clue, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it. Chapter 6. A clue in the soil. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a quiet insistence, the first light filtering through the mist to touch the rooftops and hedgerows with a pale glow. Miss Jane Marple, awake before the village stirred, stood at her cottage window, her eyes tracing the familiar outline of her garden. Her thoughts, however, were fixed on Rose Cottage and the freshly turned patch of earth in Clara Henshaw's gardener, detail that, like the smear on the cricket ball, refused to be dismissed. Her basket, packed with her knitting and a small trowel borrowed from her gardener, rested by the door. She had no intention of digging herself, of course, but a closer look at Clara's soil might reveal more than roses. The mystery of Gideon Vale's death, with its gruesome birdhouse and coded letters, was a puzzle that demanded patience, and Miss Marple was nothing if not patient. She set out early, her tweed skirt brushing the dew-damped grass, and made her way to the vicarage, where she had arranged to meet the vicar. Mr. Clement, his interest in botany, though amateur, was well known, and Miss Marple had persuaded him to accompany her to Rose Cottage under the guise of discussing Clara's roses. Mr. Clement, a gentleman with a tendency to ramble, greeted her at the vicarage gate, his face creased with worry. "Jane," he said, clutching a worn copy of the Flora of Britain, "this business with Mr. Vale is most distressing," and young Tommy Pierce, still missing its cast a shadow over the village. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Indeed, Leonard, but we must keep our spirits up. I thought a visit to Clara's garden might do us both good. Her roses are quite remarkable." The walk to Rose Cottage was brisk, the morning air sharp with the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender. Clara was already in her garden when they arrived. Her figure bent over a bed of dahlias, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her eyes. She straightened as they approached, her expression a mix of surprise and faint irritation. "Miss Marple, vicar," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "What brings you here so early?" Mr. Clement beamed, oblivious to her tone. "Your roses, Mrs. Henshaw," Jane mentioned there in fine form, and I couldn't resist a look. "Perhaps you could share your secret for such splendid blooms." Clara's lips twitched, but her eyes remained wary. "Just hard work," she said. "Would you like to see them?" Miss Marple let Mr. Clement take the lead, his chatter about soil pH and pruning techniques filling the air as she discreetly scanned the garden. The disturbed patch she'd noticed yesterday was still there. Near the rose bushes, its surface uneven, as if turned in haste. She stepped closer, her eyes catching a glint of metal half buried in the soil. "Oh, Clara," she said, her voice light, You've been busy here. Weeding, I suppose. Clara's hands tightened on her trowel. Yes, just tidying up. The roses need constant care. Miss Marple smiled, her gaze lingering on the patch. Of course, it's a lovely spot. Mind if I take a closer look? I'm hopeless with gardens, but I do admire your skill. Clara hesitated, then nodded, her reluctance clear. Miss Marple knelt, her movements careful, and brushed the soil with her fingers, revealing a small metal box, no larger than a cigarette case, its surface rusted but intact. She glanced at Mr. Clement, who was engrossed in a rose's petals, and then at Clara, whose face had paled. How curious, Miss Marple said, lifting the box. This must have been here for some time. Clara's voice was sharp. It's nothing, just an old trinket. I must have buried it by mistake. But her eyes betrayed her, darting to the box with a flicker of fear. Miss Marple handed the box to Mr. Clement, who opened it with a gentle tug. Inside was a single feather, its edges sharp and grey, and a scrap of paper with a series of numbers coordinates, perhaps, or a code. A feather, Mr. Clement said, puzzled. From one of your birds, Mrs. Henshaw. Clara shook her head, her voice tight. I don't keep birds. It must be something old, from before I moved here. Miss Marple's mind raced, the feather a clear echo of the peregrine sketch in Vale's notebook. She thought of the word falcon overheard at the Blue Boar, the coded letters in Vale's drawer. This was no coincidence, she felt, but a thread in the tapestry of Vale's death. She slipped the box into her basket, her smile serene. I'll show this to Inspector Craddock, she said. It may be nothing, but with poor Mr. Vale's murder, one can't be too careful. Clara's lips parted, as if to protest, but she said nothing, her hands twisting in her apron. Mr. Clement, sensing the tension, launched into a discourse on soil drainage, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to steer him back to the vicarage. The box a quiet weight in her basket at the vicarage. She found Constable Hurst, who agreed to take the box to the inspector. A feather and numbers, he said, scratching his head. Doesn't make much sense, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Perhaps not yet, Constable, but small things often lead to larger truths. She returned to her cottage, her thoughts buzzing. The feather, she suspected, was from a peregrine. Falcon, like the one in Vale's notebooker, bird rare in England but valuable in certain circles. The numbers could be coordinates, a code, or even a date, but their significance was tied to Vale's secrets. That afternoon, a commotion at the village green drew her attention. Young Tommy Pierce had been found, shaken but unharmed, locked in a shed near the old mill. Miss Marple hurried to the scene, where Tommy's mother was clutching him, tears streaming down her face. Inspector Craddock was questioning the boy, who sat on a bench, his eyes wide. I saw a man, Tommy said, his voice trembling, near the birdhouse, at the fete. He had a knife, and he looked at me funny. I ran, but someone grabbed me and locked me in that shed. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Did you recognize him, Tommy? She asked gently. He shook his head. It was dark, but he was tall, with a coat, like the man I saw with Mr. Vale at the pub. Miss Marple exchanged the glance with Craddock, whose face was grim. The stranger from the Blue Boar, the feather, Clara's unease, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own shape. She thought of a case years ago, when smugglers in St. Mary Mead had used bird calls to signal their movements, their secrets hidden in plain sight. The parallel was faint, but it stirred her imagination. She would send the feather to Dr. Haydock for analysis, to confirm its origin. and she would watch Clara Henshaw, whose garden held more than roses. For now, she knew one thing. The clue in the soil was a step closer to the truth, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it. Chapter 7. The Falcon's Trail. The late afternoon light draped St. Mary Mead in a soft haze, the kind that blurred the edges of the village and lent an air of quiet conspiracy to its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched on the table, her eyes fixed on the small metal box from Clara Henshaw's garden. The peregrine feather and the scrap of paper with its cryptic numbers lay beside it, each a silent challenge to her keen mind. The discovery of Tommy Pierce, shaken but safe, had lifted a weight from the village, but his tale of a tall man with a knife near the birdhouse had sharpened Miss Marple's focus. The word falcon, overheard at the Blue Boar, echoed in her thoughts. A thread tying Gideon Vale's death to the secrets buried in his cottage and Clara's soil. She rose, her movements brisk despite the hour, and reached for her coat. Dr. Haydock had promised to analyze the feather, and she intended to hear his findings. The village was settling into evening, the air cool with the promise of dusk. As she made her way to his surgery, Dr. Haydock greeted her with a wry smile, his desk cluttered with medical journals and a microscope that gleamed under the lamplight. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I've had a look at your feather. It's a peregrine falcon, no doubt about it. Rare as hen's teeth in these parts, but prized in certain, less reputable circles." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You think this has something to do with Vale, don't you?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "I think, Doctor, that Mr. Vale's ornithology was more than a hobby. This feather, the sketch in his notebook, the word falcon at the pub, they suggest a pattern." She paused, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Have you heard anything more about the stranger he met at the Blue Boar?" Haydock shook his head. "Only what Elsie said. Tall man, dark coat, hat low. The inspector's been asking around, but no one's seen him since." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the numbers in the metal box. "And these coordinates," she said, sliding the scrap of paper across the desk. "Could they point to a place nearby?" Haydock studied the numbers, his brow furrowing. "Could be. They look like map coordinates, but I'm no expert. I'd say the inspector should check the old barn near the mill. It's isolated, just the sort of place for shady dealings." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The barn, a crumbling relic on the village outskirts, was a place children avoided and adults ignored. She thanked Haydock and left, her thoughts racing. The barn, Tommy's shed, the peregrine feather, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she felt the pattern growing clearer, with Constable Hurst's permission. She accompanied him to the barn the next morning, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The structure loomed at the edge of a meadow, its timbers weathered, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Hurst, skeptical but indulgent, pushed open the creaking door, revealing a dim interior thick with the scent of dust and hay. Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the gloom, noting crates stacked in a corner, their lids pried open. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the rough wood, and peered inside. The crates held preserved bird, specimens owls, hawks, and, yes, falcons, their feathers pristine, but their bodies hollowed out. Tucked inside one was a small packet, its contents glinting in the faint light. "Constable," she said softly, "I believe we've found something." Hurst lifted the packet, revealing a handful of small, uncut diamonds, their edges catching the light like tiny stars. His jaw dropped. "Blimey, Miss Marple, what's this, then?" She smiled, her eyes sharp. "I suspect Mr. Vale was involved. In smuggling, Constable. These birds were a cover, their hollows perfect for hiding such treasures." Hurst shook his head, marveling. "And the barn? Why here?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the door, where a faint footprint marked the dust, "because it's out of sight, yet close enough to the village. The coordinates led us here, did they not?" Back at the station, Inspector Craddock examined the diamonds, his face grim. "This changes things," he said. Vale wasn't just a birdwatcher. He was mixed up in something big. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the stranger. At the pub, the man Tommy had seen with a knife. The stranger, she said, was likely Vale's contact or his killer. Tommy's description matches the man at the Blue Boar. A tall man, dark coat, seen near Clara Henshaw's cottage as well. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think Clara's involved?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "I think she knows more than she says. Her garden held that box, after all." She returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the threads together. The peregrine feather, the diamonds, the coded letters, Clara's unease, they pointed to a smuggling ring with Vale at its center. She thought of a case years ago when a fisherman in St. Mary Mead had hidden contraband in lobster pots, his trade masked by the sea's rhythms. The parallel was faint, but it stirred her imagination. The stranger, she suspected, was the Kia man who dealt in diamonds, not birds, and whose argument with Vale had ended in murder. And Clara, with her buried box and trembling hands, was a piece of the puzzle yet to be placed. The village clock chimed, its notes carrying across the green. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, and let her thoughts wander. She would speak to Clara again, perhaps with the inspector present, and she would watch for the stranger, whose shadow loomed over St. Mary Mead like a falcon circling its prey. For now, she knew one thing. The trail of the falcon was leading her closer to the truth, and she would follow it to its end. Chapter 8. The confrontation. The evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, draping the village in a quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, the fire casting flickering patterns on the walls, her knitting untouched as her mind wove together the threads of Gideon Vale's murder. The peregrine feather, the diamonds in the barn, the coded letters, and Clara Henshaw's guarded demeanor formed a tapestry of deceit, with the mysterious stranger from the Blue Boar at its center. Young Tommy Pierce's return, his tale of a man with a knife, had sharpened the puzzle's edges, and Miss Marple knew the time for gentle probing was past. A confrontation was needed, one that would coax the truth from the shadows. She arranged to meet Clara Henshaw at her cottage the next afternoon. Under the pretense of discussing the church flower committee, Inspector Craddock informed of her plan agreed to linger nearby, his presence discreet but ready. Miss Marple's basket, as always, hung from her arm, its contents unremarkable save for the small notebook where she'd jotted her observations. The air was crisp as she walked to Rose Cottage, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with the faint sweetness of Clara's roses. The garden was as immaculate as ever, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the patch of disturbed soil, now smoothed over as if to erase its secrets. Clara greeted her at the door, her face composed but her eyes wary. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "I wasn't expecting you so soon. The flower committee, you said." Miss Marple smiled, her expression soft but unwavering. "Yes, dear, but I confess I have another matter in mind. May we sit?" Clara hesitated, then led her to the parlor, where a pot of tea was already steaming. The photograph of Clara's late fiancé still stood on the mantel, its presence a silent question. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly. In her lap, "Clara," she began, her tone gentle, "this dreadful business with Mr. Vale has troubled us all. I couldn't help but notice your unease when we spoke of him, and that box in your garden such a curious find." Clara's cup clinked against its saucer, her fingers trembling. "I told you, it was nothing. Just an old trinket." Miss Marple's eyes met hers, kind but piercing. "I think it was more than that. The feather, the numbers there tied to Mr. Vale, aren't they? And perhaps to your past." Clara's face paled, and for a moment silence hung between them like a taut thread. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice steady. "Your fiancé, Clara. I've heard the village stories he vanished, some say under dark circumstances. Did Mr. Vale know something about him? Or was it you who knew something about Mr. Vale?" Clara's hands clenched, and her voice broke. "You don't understand, Jane. My fiancé Robert, he was a smuggler. He dealt in stolen goods, and he crossed the wrong people. They killed him, and I thought that was the end of it. Then Vale came, asking questions about local hiding spots, about birds. I didn't know what he was after, but I suspected. I kept quiet to protect myself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "And the box in your garden?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I found it after Vale's death, buried near my roses. I thought it might be his, something dangerous. I didn't want to be involved." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her thoughts were sharp. Clara's story rang true, yet it felt incomplete, a half-told tale. She was about to speak when a knock at the door startled them both. Inspector Craddock entered, his face grim. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Henshaw, we've had a development." He explained that Constable Hurst had spotted a man matching Tommy's description, a tall figure in a dark coat near the old barn. A trap had been set, and the man, identified as Mr. Lyle, a jeweller from London with a history of fencing stolen goods, had been caught attempting to retrieve another crate of diamonds. Under questioning, Lyle confessed to killing Vale in a dispute over a shipment, dismembering him to conceal the body in the birdhouse, believing its small size would deter suspicion. Miss Marple listened, her eyes never leaving Clara, whose relief was palpable but tinged with something else, guilt, perhaps, or fear. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "did you know Mr. Lyle?" Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, but I feared someone like him. Vale mentioned a partner, someone ruthless. I buried the box to keep it from them." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the confession. Lyle's arrest tied up many threads: the diamonds, the murder, the birdhouse, but Clara's role remained a shadow. Had she truly been a bystander, or had she played a part in Vale's scheme? As Craddock escorted Clara to the station for further questioning, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the evening air cool against her face. She sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, and let her thoughts wander. The confrontation had revealed much, but not all. Clara's past, Lyle's greed, Vale's secrets, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the final shape was near. She thought of a case years ago when a village seamstress had hidden stolen lace in her attic, her fear of discovery outweighing her guilt. The parallel was faint, but it stirred her imagination. For now, she knew one thing: the truth was close, and she would not rest until it was fully unraveled. Chapter 9. The final thread, The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft shawl, its hues of violet and gold softening the village's edges as Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles at last in motion, though her mind was far from the pale blue shawl taking shape. The confession of Mr. Lyle, the London jeweller, had unravelled much of the mystery surrounding Gideon Vale's gruesome death, a smuggling ring dealing in diamonds, concealed within hollowed-out bird specimens, and a fatal dispute that ended in the Birdhouse's macabre secret. Yet, as Miss Marple's needles clicked in their steady rhythm, she felt a quiet unease. Clara Henshaw's tearful admission, the buried box, and the shadow of her late fiancé's smuggling past formed a pattern, but one with a missing thread. The truth, she sensed, was not yet fully woven. She rose, her movements brisk despite the hour, and reached for her coat. Clara's story, though compelling, had gaps, hesitations in her eyes, a tremor in her voice that suggested more than fear. Miss Marple decided to pay her one final visit, this time with Inspector Craddock in tow, to tie up the loose ends. The air was cool as she walked to Rose Cottage, the village hushed save for the distant bark of a dog. Craddock met her at the gate, his face weary but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "you're certain there's more to Mrs. Henshaw's story?" She smiled faintly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "I'm certain, Inspector, that people rarely tell all they know, even when they wish to." Clara was in her parlour, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the photograph of her fiancé still on the mantel. She looked up as they entered, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, Inspector," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I've told you everything. I don't know what more you want." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her basket at her side, her expression gentle but unwavering. "Clara dear," she said, "you've been most helpful, but I wonder if there's something you've held back. Not out of malice, perhaps, but fear. The box in your garden, the feather, your fiancé's past. Did Mr. Vale know something that put you in danger?" Clara's eyes flickered to the photograph, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "I told you," she said, her voice breaking, "Robert was a smuggler. He died because of it, and I swore I'd never be part of that world again. When Vale came asking about hiding places, I suspected he was up to no good. I kept my distance, but after he died, I found that box in my garden. I buried it deeper, thinking it would keep me safe." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. "And did you see the man who argued with Vale at the Blue Boar? The man Tommy saw with a knife?" Clara's hands trembled, and she looked away. I saw someone, once, near my cottage, tall, in a dark coat. I thought he was watching me, but I didn't know him. I was afraid he'd come for the box." Craddock leaned forward, his voice firm. "Mrs. Henshaw, if you knew about the smuggling, why didn't you tell us?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was scared. Robert's death taught me what happens when you cross those people. I just wanted to be left alone." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Clara's fear was genuine, but her silence had protected more than herself. It had shielded the truth. "Clara," she said gently, "you must tell the inspector everything. The box, the man, anything you saw. It's the only way to be truly safe." Clara hesitated, then nodded, her voice barely audible. "I saw Vale with the man once, near the barn. They were arguing about a delivery. I didn't hear much, but Vale looked frightened. I never saw the man's face, but I knew he was dangerous." Craddock took notes, his face grim. "That fits with Lyle's confession," he said. He admitted to killing Vale over a botched deal. The diamonds were recovered, and he's in custody. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And the Birdhouse, Inspector. Why choose such a place? Craddock shrugged. Lyle said it was to throw us off too small to suspect, yet close to the village. He didn't count on Tommy Pierce poking around. The pieces fell into place, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on Clara. Her story tied up the threads Lyle's greed, Vale's smuggling, the Birdhouse's grim purpose, but her silence had delayed the truth. She thought of a case years ago when a village shopkeeper had hidden stolen goods in her cellar, her fear of exposure outweighing her honesty. The parallel was faint, but it resonated. Clara, Miss Marple said, you must trust the police. Now, no more secrets. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. I will, I promise. As they left Rose Cottage, the village was quiet, the stars emerging in the evening sky. Craddock escorted Clara to the station for a formal statement, and Miss Marple returned home, her basket lighter but her thoughts heavy. The diamonds were recovered, Lyle was arrested, and Tommy was safe, yet the village would carry the scar. Of this crime, she sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, and reflected on the Birdhouse's small, unlikely hiding place that had concealed a great darkness, much like St. Mary Mead itself. The final thread was woven, and the truth, at last, was clear. The end.